Today I am going to cover my personal top 10 visual novels that you can play in English. A while back I made a top 5 free visual novels that you could play in English, and in case you found yourself liking the visual novel medium enough to be willing to buy visual novels as well, here's 10 that I consider the greatest of the bunch. Those curious on reasons possible visual novels that didn't make it to this list can stay tuned after the list while I cover some of the more popular visual novels as well. If there's any I didn't cover and you're curious on why I didn't include them, feel free to ask in the comments. Number 10. Little Busters. Little Busters is what I consider to be the greatest key visual novel. The Common Route is what I consider to be the most fun out of any visual novel I've ever played, as well as the True Route also being the greatest out of any I've ever played. But with all that said and done, why isn't it rated higher? This is because of a few reasons. One, it's because the heroine routes that come before the True really aren't anything impressive. Not that they are necessarily bad, but just that neither the level of emotion or character development really strives very far in them. Haruka's route was probably the best of the bunch though, and it was a very enjoyable route overall. But the rest, you're not gonna get much out of them. The other problem is with the main heroine, Rin. She is very poorly developed and not very well fleshed out, and quite honestly, just doesn't seem to be much of a character. It felt more like they stuffed her in the game as an excuse to keep this a galgay because that is visual novel tradition and we can't go against that. This is a big deal because she actually plays a large part in the visual novel. Another problem is with the ending, which is a key ending, and you probably already know what that means. Suffice to say, it's extremely disappointing. However, like said before, the Common Route is fun, with lots of great comedy moments and fun minigames, which you can turn off if it's not something you really enjoy. Also, it's a very friendly visual novel, as there isn't many perverse jokes compared to other visual novels, and there's even an all-ages version if you don't like hentai scenes. The True Route is very immersive, with a great atmosphere that surrounds the whole thing. The characters are given a new level of depth you might not have seen before. Also, it comes packed with what I consider the most powerful emotional scene ever in a visual novel. However, it is a very long visual novel, so asking the player to tolerate the rest of the game just to get to the amazing True Route might be a bit too much to ask. Still, if length doesn't scare you or you have lots of free time, give it a whirl. Number 9. Forest. Forest will probably be the strangest visual novel you've ever read if you decide to tackle it. It's essentially the Alice in Wonderland of visual novels, which is not me being clever, I assure you, as the game is basically saying it is an Alice in Wonderland inspired visual novel. I mean, it brings elements from Alice. They mention Alice in Wonderland several times. It's not me being clever, trust me. Everything in the game can be interpreted to have a greater meaning, or at least be enjoyed by the sheer oddness of everything in it. If you're looking for a straightforward plot, then Forest is certainly not for you. However, it contains great music, great atmosphere, and a quirky plot that's hard not to get captured by. The problem with Forest is the various sex scenes, which really broke the immersion for me. And while they had subtle meaning to them to a degree, I just couldn't enjoy how often they came about. It just felt unnecessary and was only included because the writer was forced to bring 18+ content to the game because that's how these visual novels sell. Also, the characters aren't quite interesting or well developed enough to really stick with you. Still, if you want a very strange experience, then Forest will certainly provide. Number 8. Muv Luv Alternative, or Muv Luv Alternative 4. If you play enough that game, you'll get that. It might seem strange to put Muv Luv so low, as it has a massive fan base, and for good reason. It's got intense action, lots of powerful moments, some great messages, and well-developed characters. What's not to like? Well, there's a big problem with this game. Actually 3, which I will cover. Number 1. You are forced to read 2 games before Alternative, being Muv Luv Extra and Unlimited. Neither of these games are particularly impressive or would be worth reading on their own. The second, the genre and tone shift is a bit too extreme between these games. This has to be the oddest trilogy I've ever read. The first game is a slice-of-life comedy wacky romance with not even a hint of any dark moments. Unlimited is a slice-of-life comedy wacky romance training shonen visual novel with mechs in it, which is also fairly, lighthearted. An Alternative is an extremely dark, depressing, immature game with lots of shocking moments. This is asking far too much of players in my opinion. While I liked Muv Luv Extra and Unlimited okay, there will be several who do not care for them and just want to get to Alternative. Unfortunately, both are necessary to the overall plot and characterization of the main character Takeru. Some people might be a fan of slice of life, but not so much dark stuff as well. It's just too much of a tone shift. Even Rewrite had hints of its darker and more serious moments in its common route. And the third problem is the info dumps. Info dumps are boring and basically the visual novel saying it's time to stop telling a story and time to lecture the player on why the plot makes sense. It's the most unclever and boring way to disclose plot details. While some info dumps are more tolerable than others, the ones in Muv Luv are most certainly a snooze fest. And a final problem is the game has a lousy and unsatisfying ending, which is much like Little Busters. Many visual novels have a bad habit of doing this. However, like said, the game is really otherwise quite good once you actually get to the good parts of the visual novel. The production values are through the roof and the shocking moments truly are quite captivating. Takeru receives some of the most character development I've ever seen in a single protagonist, and many of the side characters are quite good as well. I do feel like the side heroines from the first and second game kind of feel like they're just there in alternative, but otherwise it's a pretty solid cast. Number 7, Fatestay Night. Another one that might come across as rather low. In Fatestay Night, you'll find two of the best routes ever in a visual novel and one of the most boring routes ever in a visual novel. Alongside, you'll find a complex cast of characters, which is complemented by a great vocal cast. And it's probably the best outside of Domine Echo. You got performances from Joji Nakata, it's hard to beat that. The various action scenes range from intense to incredibly meaningful and captivating depending on who's fighting who, and the music is some of the most memorable in the industry as basically everyone knows what Emiya is and what it sounds like by this point. However, that doesn't forgive the Fate route, which, like said before, is mostly insufferable. It's slow, full of info dumps, and the story and development of the characters just isn't anything great. It doesn't help that Saber is probably the least interesting character in this game. Even the fights lack the tension they have in the other routes because Shiro feels too safe because Saber is always there with him for the most part. Even when Gilgamesh and Kantomine finally enter the scene, it's not enough to save this route. And when 1/3 of the game is otherwise quite boring, I can't hope to rate it much higher. Unlimited Blade Works, however, is a superb route that's paced much better, feels much more tense, and is constantly exciting with its various twists and turns. Rin is also one of the best visual novel heroines in general, so having her be in the spotlight here really helps, and Archer being one of the best males. Things slow down a bit with Heaven's Feel, but at least our main character Shiro gets the most character development he gets throughout the entire game in this route. Also, Katomine finally becomes more of a full-fledged character and is seriously one of the most interesting and badass in the medium. Things are also quite a bit darker, which might throw some people off, but it's nothing compared to the shift in Muv Luv. Also, the so-called main antagonist of this route really isn't that great. Better than your standard anime villain for sure, but compared to Katomine, she's just lacking. Still, the route is filled with great memorable moments and some of the most emotional scenes in the game, which will surely leave an impact on many players. Number 6, Sharin no Kuni. Sharin no Kuni rates high for a few reasons. 1, it's incredibly well paced the entire way through, and 2, the main antagonist is perhaps the best in the whole medium. Also, the unique setting is used skillfully, without a need to info dump and explain every last detail about it. But seriously, many visual novels have a padding problem where they are intentionally dragging things out as long as possible with no sense of how to keep things concise. Sharin no Kuni was the first visual novel I played that did not suffer from this problem. In fact, there's hardly any real flaws that I can point about it in the first place. Sure, it can be a little cheesy, and the main heroines can't really live up to the protagonist or the main antagonist, but they are not bad characters either. They're flawed and realistic, but probably not the most appealing for most visual novel fans. Still, Hozuki and Kenichi really knock it out of the park with this game. Almost every scene they are involved in will easily have audience members glued to the screen. The game is just so solidly written, and it's the visual novel that I can most easily recommend on this list. Number 5, Danganronpa 2. The reason Danganronpa 2 is over Danganronpa 1 in games like Phoenix Wright is even though they are all very entertaining, well-paced games, I feel like Danganronpa 2 just has a bit more edge in its creativity and emotional department than those. But seriously, play Danganronpa 1 and Phoenix Wright as they are great games as well. Danganronpa 2 is what I would consider the most consistently entertaining visual novel I've ever read, even more than Sharin no Kuni. Yes, it's wackier, but it plays that angle at full strength, and yet it still manages to capture emotions quite well if you ask me. Still, it almost never misses a beat, it's never boring, and it still requires the characters to think a good bit with every case involved. The cast of characters overall might not be the most memorable or well developed, but Komaeda and Monokuma more than make up for any defects. Yes, there are free time events, but overall this isn't quite what you would get from other visual novels. Again, with Monokuma and Komaeda, they seriously might be the most entertaining characters ever in a visual novel. Never have I laughed at the absurdness of characters as consistently as these two. Plus, the plot makes a lot of great twists despite being absurd, keeping things unpredictable and always exciting. Do yourself a big favor and at least attempt to read Danganronpa 1 so you can read this one, as it's quite the fun game. However, if you don't like that game, you probably won't like this one any better. Number 4, Cross-Channel. With Cross-Channel, you really won't be getting any likable character, or even fully developed characters for some of them. So in all, it might not be very appealing to read for most visual novel readers. However, what it does better than any visual novel I've ever read is atmosphere. All the characters being trapped in a town all by themselves, while they themselves seem unstable even in a normal society, provides a very uncomfortable and strange feeling once the plot starts. Though that's not the only credit I'll give it. The main character Taichi is probably the most interesting main character in the whole medium. At first he seems like just another pervert, which unfortunately will be the main turnoff for this visual novel for many people, but you realize that almost all his actions and the actions of the other characters around him all have a deeper meaning to them. It's a visual novel that really keeps you guessing and on your toes despite its relatively slow pace. It also contains one of my favorite endings ever, which is highly subject to interpretation, the best kind of ending. I like that this game is never too straightforward as well. If you can get past the slow part and Taichi's initial perversion, I highly recommend at least giving this one a try, even if it is most certainly not for everyone. Number 3, Swan Song. Much like Cross-Channel, this visual novel also does atmosphere quite well, with very little ever breaking it unlike Forest. The setting isn't as unique, but the cast of characters feels more consistently well written. This is a very dark game with things like rape and murder all throughout it, so it's definitely not something for everyone. However, if you're fine with that, you'll come across some of the most believable and well-developed characters in the visual novel medium. Even random side characters can offer a lot of interesting perspectives, making reading this a treat the whole way through. There really isn't anything negative I can think about it other than the good ending, which is laughable in comparison to the normal ending. On that subject, the normal ending is one of my favorite endings ever, and what I consider to be one of the most powerful visual novel scenes in general. I love how even though this visual novel shows you so much of the worst side of humanity, it balances it with showing you some of the best, which makes things grim, but not without hope. Actually, the subject of hope and other various themes is something the visual novel tackles quite often. Thankfully, it's not really shoved in your face either, and is consistent with the type of character presenting their perspective. Overall, a great experience and one of the finest visual novels ever made. Number 2, Steins Gate. The main question to be asked about Steins Gate is, should I play it if I watch the anime? I'll be clear, the anime for Steins Gate is one of the best adaptations in visual novel history. It took several scenes and made them far stronger than its visual novel counterpart, and even took out a large majority of the info dump, which is always a good thing. Yet, I still like the visual novel a bit more. However, it's not a must-read if you've watched the anime. Give it a try if you like visual novels, otherwise you aren't missing out on too much. Yes, the problem with Steins Gate to me is primarily two things. One, the info dumps, which at least are slightly more tolerable than most because Okabe makes them fun, and two, the first half of Ferris's route, which is where the creativity is just out the window there, and overall just is a really lame part of the game. Thankfully, the anime essentially cut this out as much as possible, probably due to the route being embarrassingly bad in the first half. The second half is great, though. So with that being said, why rate the visual novel so high? Because not only is Okabe one of the most entertaining main characters in the medium, he's coupled with one of the best heroines in the medium, Kurisu. This duo seriously has the best chemistry I've ever read outside of the number one choice. Yes, you can technically select other heroines to end early with, and those endings are actually all quite good in their own way. But the spotlight is mostly stolen by Kurisu, and she's obviously the main heroine, where the true route ends, actually, so yes, she is the main heroine. Though they wouldn't be great if they were just entertaining, as Okabe gets some of the most growth out of all the main characters I've read about to the point where his own humanity is on the line. Watching his struggle is both fascinating and tormenting. Some of this is left out of the anime, but it's still presented very well in it. I really like how many what-ifs the plot contains, as every action in the visual novel seems to have far greater consequences than what you would normally think. It really puts a lot more value on the choices you're given later on. Choices in visual novels in general always feel like fluff to me. They're just pick your heroine kind of choices. But here, I actually felt the weight presented on many of them, as there was never a perfect solution. This is why even the side heroines contain some great endings on their own. All in all, it ends with a very powerful conclusion if you ask me. Steins Gate is actually my favorite visual novel, but I don't think it quite deserves number 1 because number 1 is Domine Echo! So what's it do better than any of these visual novels, you might ask? Well, primarily I have to say, I think the characters feel like they have more meaning, thought, and care put into each and every one of them more than any other visual novel I've ever read. The plot is probably the most creative thing I've ever experienced in general, and is really a playground for the mind in every sense of the word. Much like Cross Channel and Forest, you're going to have to second guess and think about the interpretation of many events and characters in this game. Battler and Beatrice, even more than Okabe and Kurisu, contain the best chemistry I've ever seen out of any pair ever. Every scene with these two involved is a complete joy. Actually, funny enough, this is the longest visual novel out of all of them. But actually, no scene in general feels like fluff. Yet, even if it wasn't just thought-provoking and had great characters, it also contains some of the best emotional moments I've ever read in a visual novel. The first part of Chapter 8 in general is possibly one of the most heartfelt experiences I've ever read in a story. It's also a really exciting read for the most part, as the antagonists, if we want to call them that is, are all well characterized and feel truly like a force to be reckoned with. I hate to repeat myself, but that's the main thing. The characterization of all the characters is so good that I would like to call this the monster of visual novels. The monster anime of visual novels. Really good anime, you should watch it. It really is that damn good. For such a long game to actually use its length to its full use is really strange for me, as I'm used to visual novels being padded for the sake of it. Not to mention the music. The music is the best out of any visual novel ever. Almost 200 frickin' tracks, which is at least quadruple to at least 6 times as many tracks as any other visual novel will give you. And they are all quality tracks. They're not bad. None of them are bad. That's crazy. And I listen to them quite frequently in my spare time. Honestly, this visual novel is just hard to complain about other than it's a beast to tackle because it's so dang long. There's a few choices with the plot that I don't necessarily agree with, but the execution is always good, so that's really just me being nitpicky. To top it off, Domine Echo has my favorite ending of all time. That's any medium ever. And that's a definite plus for me because I hold endings in high regard. I highly recommend this game for everyone to read as long as you think you have the time for it. If you're working a full-time job, you probably might want to reconsider and read a shorter game. It's really good though, so it'll be worth your time, I hope. So that's my top 10. I know people were probably expecting a few more choices that I've left out, but I'll try to discuss some of them on why they would be left out now. Otherwise, this list is over. You can turn off the video. You know, if you don't care to listen to this, or if you have a question you want to ask me, feel free to leave it in the comments. But let's start with some of the most popular visual novels that I didn't include on this list. Grisaya. Why isn't Grisaya on this list? Because it really doesn't do anything drastically well, and it's really padded out. Sure, it's got some good funny moments, the flashbacks are good, and there's some good emotional scenes, like Sachi's ending primarily. Overall, most of these are done better in other visual novels. For example, Angelic Howl in Amane's Route is similar to how Swan Song is done, but just doesn't have that same atmosphere quality to the characters. Not to mention, Kazuki is far too competent of the character for the tension to be very tangible in that situation. And while the game is fun, it's not as consistently fun as Danganronpa 2 or Phoenix Rider games. It's way too padded out. The route quality is also not very consistent, with Makina's route being insanely dragged out, and the first half of Amane's Route just being essentially pure porn. It's crap. Not to mention the sequels just aren't very good. I know I shouldn't include those because I should be talking about Kajitsu, but they're still a part of this overall story of Grisaya, so it's hard to leave them out, just like it's hard to leave out Extra and Unlimited. I mean, they were a part of the experience. It's all one complete story. Meikyu is a glorified fan disc with one extra route that should have just been in the original game, so it's basically a waste of money, but you have to buy it if you want to get the full Grisaya experience. And Rakuin is essentially a joke of a game, and I'm not going to review that one unless people really want me to. If you thought you want to know what I think about Rakuin? This is my review. If you thought Grisaya the Hollywood movie was a good idea, then you might like Grisaya no Rakuin. But otherwise, it failed to impress me in any sense of the word. And it was a disgusting way to end the series, if you ask me. I did not expect the series to end like that. I don't know what I expected, but I expected something a bit more than that. I didn't know I already read the best part of the series with Kajitsu. And I'm not trying to ruin the experience for anyone, as, just so you know, a lot of my friends, they like Rakuin. So, some people like it, okay? So, if you're still a hardcore Grisaya fans, give it a whirl because you might like it, but me, I was like, I can't believe they made this game. Ever 17. Why not Ever 17? It's a pretty good story, but it's dragged down because it's got terrible pacing, bad comedy, and a not-so-great cast of characters, if you ask me. There's things I like about it, like I said in my review, but other than Tsugumi, no one in the cast really caught my eye too much. I mean, Sora was okay too, but, you know, you get better characters in other visual novels, so it's like, eh. The final route is, of course, good, but for that, you'll have to suffer through 30 hours of kind of boredom to get to that last 5 hours. Also, like I said in my review, the routes cross up too much, meaning if you raid Tsugumi's route first and go and play Sora's route, you'll have to do a lot of skipping around throughout the common route after each new Sora scene, causing the game not to flow very well together. And it becomes quite confusing, and the game's story is already confusing, so that doesn't help things. Unless you feel like rereading the common route every single time, it just doesn't blend well together. Jisenjo no Mao. This one's a real question, I think, for a lot of people. Jisenjo no Mao is a fun game, but it's an absolute mess of a plot. Like I said in my review, spoilers, it makes no sense that Kyosuke is the Mao. The game clearly did not build up to this, and he even is the Mao in the side routes. I just thought the game forgot about that, but no, the author actually said, oh yeah, he's the Mao in the side routes, just not in the main route. So, the game's author retconned his own story. I've never heard of a visual novel doing that. I don't think that's a good thing. Now, I like the side routes. I know people, they hate the side routes for some reason. I guess because they're different, you know, they're not as exciting as the main route because they're more about character development, and I guess people don't like character development is what they're telling me. Yeah, I really like the side routes, and at least they made sense with the plot to some degree, but the main route doesn't make any sense. To me, this is just plain trickery on the player, with its obnoxious red herrings. Sorry, but him and the Mao both getting headaches and blackening out, the psychiatrist visits, and all the other things in the common round pretty much perceive no feasible way it could be anyone else. Yeah, I know, Kyosuke, how could he kill Haru's mother when he was a kid? Yes, that's what I'm saying. The plot is a mess. It makes no sense. He obviously probably went back and added those details because he had to, he's like, oh, well, you know, I gotta make some details to make the plot make more sense that it's Kyosuke, even though it doesn't make any sense that even though it doesn't make any sense that the Mao isn't Kyosuke either. So, yeah, the plot's a giant mess, and it just fools you, which I am completely against. And I really think they did this because they couldn't figure out a way for Kyosuke to end up with Haru because, he was the Mao and the Mao was our arch enemy. How would that work out? And that would have made their game interesting, but they chose to just do what they did and cover it up with explosions and murder and an emotional ending. The ending is actually kind of good, actually. Too bad it doesn't make sense with the rest of the game. That's why the more I think about Jisenjo no Mao, the less I like it. The build-up betrays itself and gives you something else which simply doesn't work with the rest of the game. Not only that, but much like Rin from Little Busters, Haru is practically given no development in this game compared to the other characters. She starts out as a quirky girl who has an obsessive hatred for the Mao, and she ends, and right until the last 5 minutes, a quirky girl who has an obsessive hatred for the Mao. That's not development. You have to have development throughout the game. That's how you make interesting characters. That's why Domine Echo has very interesting characters, because they develop throughout the game. But apparently being cool and quirky is all you need to be a great character, right? Much like Kazuki. Yeah. It was very disappointing, because I will say she did have a likable personality otherwise, but that's really all she has going for her. And finally, Rewrite. Rewrite, just like J Senjo, is a mess of a game. It should have only been written by Romeo, as the genre shifts and tone shifts and differences between routes not only conflict with the story, but they also serve as a jarring change between the routes. For example, we have Lucia's route, which is horror in the first part, then turns into politics, then turns into romance and shonen. Yay! That works so well together. And, you know, and it's like, horror in this game? Are you joking me? Like, it just doesn't work. And then we have Chihaya's route, which is full-on shonen the whole route. And it's like, well, okay. You know, and I like Chihaya's route and all, but it just, you know, the tone shifts between the routes is just ridiculous. And the final route is also really rushed, and not a lot of thought was put into it. For example, when Mr. T-Rexer comes along and conveniently kills some people that were in Kotaro's way, they were like after him or something. He conveniently kills them and tells Kotaro, or tells whoever's around him, "I'm just on a walk." Even though we've know from Rewrite that summon beasts, when used, have to use the lives of other people to be summoned and to be moved and such. So they summoned him to take him on a walk. Yeah. Ugh. A shame this kind of crap happened. There's more moments of crap like this in Terra. It's just dumb. It doesn't make any sense with the rest of the game, and it's obvious that Romeo just didn't care when he wrote Terra. Which is a shame, because I like Romeo stuff. I like Saihate no Ima. I like Cross Channel. I put it on this list for crying out loud. And I found Rewrite to be quite fun, with like a lot of good moments otherwise. But the payoff served to make it the most disappointing visual novel I've ever read. I mean, Kotaro and Terra did everything for Kaguri's sake. Why? Because... most forced romance ever conceived. He had absolutely no reason to love her. Not only that, he doesn't get back any of his memories during this route. This is like if Takeru in Muv Luv Alternative never got his memories back and just did things. Just because. It's disappointing and thoroughly unengaging. Which is a shame, because Terra actually has my favorite bit in the game, which is the war bit, which actually has that atmosphere that Romeo's good at creating. And I love that bit. But the rest of the game is a sloppy mess, and it's obviously clearly rushed. Not giving Kotaro any real motivation to do what he's doing is just, and including characters that no one really cared about, expanding upon them rather than characters we kind of... It just was a completely disappointing experience, and I couldn't believe the writer chose to do that. And the game just doesn't work well together, like I said, with the other routes. And those are the visual novels I can think of that should have made this list, maybe, but they just couldn't, because they just have problems, big problems, and I find those problems to be unforgivable.